Well, I'm a space geek, and I'm not going to apologize for that. It's just what you're going to get. I think that there are some people out there, maybe even in this audience, who are interested in visiting Mars someday. In fact, some of you probably are so interested that you'd be willing to make it a one-way trip. That is, permanently settle on the surface of another planet. There's even a not-for-profit organization called the Mars One organization that is signing up people. Now, for all those of you out there interested in making this one-way trip, I guess I have some advice I'd like to offer. So here's my advice. First, Mars colonists. And first of all, why a one-way trip? Well, it's not rocket science. Okay, it is rocket science. It's not brain surgery. Okay, it's not brain surgery. It's simple. It has to do with the fuel it takes. You know, if you're going from Earth to Mars, it takes about the same amount of fuel as going from Mars to Earth. But if you've got to make that round trip, you have to carry all that fuel for the return trip with you. And even worse, you have to carry the fuel to get back. Even worse than that, you got to carry the fuel to carry the fuel to carry the fuel to get you back. It turns out it's a consequence of something called the rocket equation, that the more you need to fire that rocket engine, you get an increase, an exponential increase in the amount of fuel you have to take along with you. To the point where that becomes the driving factor. It's actually very difficult to travel very far in space because of the fuel you have to carry the fuel and so forth. Let me back up a little bit. We've known how to send probes to Mars for a long time. In fact, there have been about 50 Mars missions so far. Most of them have failed, it turns out. The first one was in 1960. It was a Russian spacecraft called Korabl 4. The first one to be successful was 5 years later, in 1965. NASA's Mariner 4 was a successful flyby of the planet Mars. Now, in the modern era, they're about half successful. In fact, almost all the ones that have been successful have been made by the Jet Propulsion Lab in California. That's under NASA sponsorship. These successful Mars missions have taught us a lot about how to send a robotic spacecraft to Mars. We send robots there to learn about science, to explore in various ways that humans can't, and at the moment we can't send people to Mars. That's what's going to be difficult. We can learn from how we've sent robotic spacecraft to Mars. We can learn a little bit about the human missions, but so far we don't know how to make those human missions work. It's going to take some innovation, in fact a lot of innovation. So here's a series of technology advances across multiple disciplines that we're going to need in order to make that Mars mission, that human Mars mission, successful. This is NASA's assessment of the round trip story. It's a daunting task that's ahead of us. There's one key technology that's going to make a big difference, and that's, maybe you can't quite see it, it says improved cryogenic boil-off. Now, this has to do with rocket fuel, and it has to do with the fact that the best rocket fuel is probably oxygen and hydrogen. That's what the Space Shuttle main engine used, for example. If you can solve this one problem of preventing that liquid oxygen and hydrogen from boiling off into space, you can drop the mass of a journey to Mars to about half or less of what you thought it might be. Now on the vertical axis there, that is mass in terms of International Space Station's worth of mass. You know, we could just barely afford the ISS right now. So any Mars mission that's going to take more than a few ISS's worth of mass is probably a non-starter, certainly in this financial environment. So we've got to get it down to below that. This is one way to go. You could try to reduce that cryogenic boil-off, keep the fuel from evaporating into space in a few days after launch. You could knock down a few other things and maybe get it down to 2 or 3 ISS's worth of mass. That's still a lot to ask. But that's where this one-way trip comes in. The benefits of going one way aren't just that you save half the fuel. Because of the rocket equation, you save most of the fuel. In fact, it looks like all in, the cost of a one-way Mars mission is maybe 1/10 of the cost of an entire round-trip mission. But that's not the only benefit. There's another one, and it has to do with this. It has to do with radiation. So the space between planets is a really inhospitable place. It's got galactic cosmic rays, gamma radiation, high-energy particles, all sorts of things that fly through your cells and rip apart your DNA and give you cancer. It's not a good thing. NASA has a requirement that for its astronauts, it's their lifetime exposure to space can't be more than would cause their statistical odds of dying from cancer to increase by more than about 3% over their lifetime. This is a hard problem to solve. Now, the thing is, we don't have this problem on the Earth, right? I mean, we don't worry about galactic cosmic rays here particularly, and that's because Earth helps out a lot. The bulk of the Earth itself shields us from that radiation, as well as the magnetosphere, the atmosphere, and you can see the aurora there. That's interaction with the magnetosphere, the magnetic field of Earth. It also turns out that the space station benefits from the Earth's magnetic field. You can see at the top there. You get quite a relief from the galactic cosmic rays just by being within the magnetic field of the Earth. But deep space is not that friendly. About a month in deep space, using the technologies we understand now, would be enough to cause an astronaut to exceed that 3% limit. So what can we do to fix that? This is where my first bit of advice to you future Mars colonists comes in. Build your houses underground. What we call the Martian regolith, that's the soil that's all over the surface of Mars, that will block virtually all of the radiation. You'll see on the top there, that's a picture of some sod houses from Iceland. Down below is a concept for a Mars habitation. How you would do this, you might in fact cover up the habitats with some kind of machinery, put the regolith on top, or maybe you start building your colony near the edge of a steep incline and cause a little avalanche to sort of shovel the particles onto the surface of your habitats for you. Whatever it would take, get underground quickly. It might seem a little depressing and dark to be living underground. You've gone to Mars to look around, and here you are stuck with cabin fever. Well, you know, the earliest English colonists on this continent encouraged their kids to play outside. The first person born to English parents in the New World was Virginia Dare. That was in 1587. I bet Virginia Dare's parents encouraged her to play outside. But the Virginia Dare of Mars, whenever she's born, she can explore the lava tubes on just under the surface of Mars. She can walk through Valles Marineris, the deepest canyon anywhere in the solar system. And she can explore the ice crevasses on the poles of Mars. And in doing all this, she's exploring parts of the planet where the radiation is more or less ineffective. That is, all these structures save her from exposure to radiation. But when she goes onto the surface, just be sure she wears her pressure suit, her radiation suit. Lava tubes. So I'm not talking about active volcanoes here. We're talking about vestigial trails through the rock that the lava has made a long time ago. So you get these sort of tube shapes. You might remember this novel by Robert Heinlein. It's called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. The lunar colonists in that novel, they farm inside lava tubes. They're pressurized with air in the novel, and sunlight streams in through some kind of skylights to provide the light that's necessary for those crops to grow. The thing is that on the moon, agriculture is quite difficult. It's not just a matter of finding the nutrients, it's that the day is 28 days long, 28 Earth days long, 14 days of night, 14 days of daylight. But on Mars, it's a convenient 24 and a half hours long. Plants can grow on Mars. It's actually not that difficult. In fact, just recently we discovered that there's nitrogen in the regolith of Mars that could be used as fertilizer. This is a concept from the Mars One organization. It's a greenhouse using Martian supplies and resources to grow plants. So here's my second piece of advice for you would-be Mars colonists. Think 1700. The early colonists on this continent didn't have much. They rarely even had nails. They certainly didn't have a ready supply of replacement integrated circuits, graphite fiber epoxy composites and Kevlar. They didn't have any of that sort of thing. What would the first Mars colonists find in ready supply? Water and regolith. This is a crater on Mars. You can see where an impact has caused water from below the surface to bubble up and freeze into a patch of ice right in the middle there. And you can see ice in the kind of shadowed rim of the crater. Ice turns out to be virtually everywhere on Mars. In fact, it's all throughout the solar system. It's on asteroids, it's on the moon. We used to think that the universe was a very dry place. Not true. The last 18 months or so have shown us that there is water in ready supply all over Mars. So on Mars, clay bricks, ceramics, earthenware, all this sort of stuff makes sense as a technology that can help you build your lives at first, when you first get there. But I think that you Mars colonists will experience rapid growth in the technologies and material science that can let you do even more. Those clay bricks will give way to an iron age, quickly followed by aluminum and maybe plastics. You'll know where you're headed, unlike our ancestors who had to develop iron technology over the course of thousands of years. But you'll also find ways to do things with a Martian regolith that we've never thought of before. This is an example of that kind of creativity I'm talking about. This is from Barak Kashnevis. He's at the University of Southern California. It's a concept for a 3D printer for the surface of the moon. The regolith goes in and cement comes out. The idea is here they're printing up a landing pad or something for a lunar mission. A 3D printing technology or additive manufacturing technologies in general, that could be a way that you could use the Martian regolith that our distant ancestors never would have thought of in the Iron Age. Examples of how enterprising the early settlers of this continent are on display at this museum. It's called the Henry Mercer Museum. It's in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. What's surprising about this really idiosyncratic collection of stuff from the 1700s and 1800s is not their ability to use components from the old world in the new, but their ability to innovate with what they found. For example, raising a bucket from a well. So you can see there's a long beam, kind of diagonally in the picture. What you do is you cut down a tree, you bounce it on a fulcrum with a heavy end toward you, and use it as a lever to pull the bucket out of the well. That's instead of building all the gears and the complicated mechanisms that require metals in order to allow you to raise and lower a bucket the way you probably would think of lowering it in a well. Or buckets, or barrels, let's say. So these barrels here are made out of a sycamore tree. Since colonists didn't have access to the skills of a cooper or let alone those metal bands that hold the staves in place, they would chop down a sycamore tree, cut it into cylindrical sections the size of a barrel, and hollow it out. And there's your barrel. Now, I'm not saying you're going to find wood on Mars. What I am saying is that necessity is the mother of invention. So my next bit of advice is to innovate. Your Mars colony needs space hackers. It needs do-it-yourselfers, members of the maker community. Here's one of my favorite ones. This is Zach Manchester. He's a student at Cornell University who built a spacecraft funded entirely on Kickstarter.com. This is a website where the public can fund your own project. He used off-the-shelf components and some wit, and he launched that spacecraft last year. In fact, it carried into orbit about 104 individual cracker-sized satellites this big, each one of which was sponsored by a single donor on the Kickstarter website. So you need this kind of person. I don't think that the Mars hacker will have a ready supply of all the components you could want that you could order out of a catalog. You'll have to make do with what there is. And what there is, again, is water. It's all over the surface and under the surface. Meteor strikes expose it pretty often. What this means for you is that oxygen and hydrogen is in ready supply. And that's convenient because it's a great rocket fuel. You can generate that oxygen and hydrogen from water by electrolysis. That's a chemical process. You add electricity, you get gases separating from the water. Any kid can do this, and so can graduate students at Cornell, where we've actually built a prototype of a rocket engine that runs on water. So you fill up that container on the lower left with water. An electrolyzer, part of a fuel cell battery, separates it into its constituent oxygen and hydrogen molecules. And then that gas travels into a combustion chamber, we ignite it with a spark plug, and you have thrust. So this is space shuttle combustion chemistry for about $50. And I think that's the kind of future that we could be looking at on Mars. So my final bit of advice for you Mars colonists is come back soon. Is put your affairs in order, be prepared for this one-way trip, but talk to your friends about this. They will try to convince you out of this. They'll say, there's a doom and gloom scenario here, and I guess I can see that. But I actually reject this no-win scenario, this Kobayashi Maru scenario. What I say is, the first thing I would do if I were in your shoes, I would start building the tools, the equipment, and even the economic structures to enable you to build a replacement vehicle to go back to Earth as soon as I get there. Let's hope like that wouldn't be completely out of the question. I mean, it's easier to lift off from the surface of Mars than to lift off the surface of the Earth. I think that the right group of engineers and technologists and hackers, you could put together something credible within a decade or two. And remember, you don't have to rely only on your own skills. You'll have the internet. You'll be able to get plans from home, run ideas by experts here on Earth, and maybe even get test results from experimental technologies that people are working on right here. Megabit per second laser communications will make this all possible. In fact, NASA demonstrated laser communications from the Earth to the Moon and back just last year. So this is a technology we understand. And I think that unlike Virginia Dare and her parents, you won't be alone out there. You'll have the rest of the world to help you out. So here's what you'll do. You'll build some tanks out of whatever you can find in the environment. Ceramics like alumina, for example. That's not a difficult thing to build out of the Martian regolith. Build your alumina fuel tanks. Create the rest of the spacecraft. Turn that water into oxygen, hydrogen gas. Load up your fuel tanks, that's the spherical tanks you see in the picture here, and take off from the surface and enter low Mars orbit. There you're going to dock with a number of water-filled tanks that you launched several months earlier, and that water in those tanks is what you'll use to return to Earth, or at least to the Earth-Moon system somewhere, where maybe somebody nice will pick you up and bring you back home. So, there are ethical issues with this sort of one-way trip to Mars. In my opinion, I think as long as everyone is an adult, as long as we're all clear on the risks involved, why not? In fact, I think we may be morally obligated not to stand in the way of people who want to do something extraordinary, like go to Mars and settle it. Someday soon, NASA will bring back some samples from Mars. Soon after that, they'll send astronauts and scientists to Mars. And that's what NASA's always done. They've led the way. They showed us the way to low Earth orbit and the Moon. Soon they'll show us the way to Mars. They're going to open that door for us. Settlement of the solar system, that next step, is up to you. You can walk through that door. And when I say you, maybe I mean us. I'd kind of like to go along with you. So that's my advice. Thank you.